Yo, welcome back everyone. Scotty Combat here, and today we're going to compare the SNES, the Sega, and a little bit of the arcade ports of Mortal Kombat II. Mostly SNES and Sega, but for the sake of comparing it to the main source, we will be throwing arcade in there as well. And thank you for being here. Let's jump into it. Now, whether you're a fan of the Sega Genesis version or the Super Nintendo version, heck, you probably might just prefer the arcade version. You may notice some pretty interesting and neat details apart from these ports that make them special in their own right. Objectively speaking here, the SNES does have more colors than the Sega Genesis version. Although I don't think that means it's technically better, you can definitely tell the difference between the stages and the characters here. And although Genesis doesn't have as many colors, sometimes I still prefer it, like Reptile for example. I think he has a more vibrant green to him than the Super NES version. Also, a detail that remains consistent between the Super Nintendo and the other consoles is the characters' names and where they're placed. As you can tell with the Super NES, some people may prefer the names actually below the life bar. Myself, I actually do like to see it inside the life bar. I would say the text even looks pretty similar, it's just the placement in this case. Another detail I want to point out is the shadows on the characters. The Sega actually does have shadows, right? Well, the Super Nintendo does too, and actually, even though they don't stick out as prominently as the Sega, they actually do match the shape of the character better. It's not just a black bubble underneath the character. Now, like I did share in the beginning, I do want to share the arcade port at times as well, just to appreciate how good it is. The shadows are very prominent, you do get to see the whole figure, everything looks really clean. That's why I want to make this comparison here too, that is the arcade version. So when we do go back and forth between Sega and Super Nintendo, even though they have enough differences of their own, we can see truly where the full detail is in comparison. I know this isn't going to sound like it makes much sense to some folks, but I kind of prefer the Sega version in cases like this at the Deadpool, but I will give credit where it's due. The Super Nintendo version, having that flare in the background behind the vents, that's actually not there in most ports, even the arcade version. Now, there is something I did notice with the Super Nintendo is things going on in the background. You do have that with the Super Nintendo where the Sega doesn't, but I will say I think the background is more vibrant. I like that it pops more. I feel like this is a good example of preference if none of the details shared yet have got any of us talking yet. I don't know if it was a limitation for why we got different colors on Sega, because the Wasteland, even in the arcade, is supposed to be more purple, and I feel like I can see things back there a little bit better. Now I say we go ahead and compare all three. This right here is the Sega, which is the only version, aside from the handheld ports, that has a different floor color than the other versions. You got the stone gray, but you still have the purple background for the Outworld / Wasteland environment, right? I do gotta give it to Super Nintendo for being closer to the actual source because it is more purple, just like the arcade version. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this. I've even seen the Sega version being compared to as what looks to be like a beta version of the game. I like this version the most, but I still appreciate what other ports try to do as well, as far as the stages, the characters, the sounds. Speaking of sounds, I say we go ahead and do a comparison of the Sega, Super NES, and arcade so we can tell the difference in all three of them. Now this next one here, when it comes to stage comparison, Super Nintendo takes it hands down. You can tell by the background detail. I don't even have to point it out, I'm sure you noticed right off the bat what was missing. In case someone did miss it, you do have someone floating in the background for the Super NES version, and there's no one there in the Sega version. What I really don't like here though is the sound of Sub-Zero's ice puddle. That sounds so bad. That sounds terrible. This one's actually really hard for me because I love the Living Force just in general, but I think they both look great here. That's the difficult thing. I do think it's clear that the Super Nintendo is closer to the arcade in color, but I like how deep the colors are for the Sega. It makes the stages actually look pretty cool. And again, that could be nostalgia pulling some override and making me a little biased on the stages, well, the colors in general. I think these stages do fine in their own right versus UMK3 on the Sega and the SNES because the UMK3 had more details. That's not to say Mortal Kombat 2 doesn't have details in the background, but since there's not as many, it seems like there's less things cut from the Sega version than the Super Nintendo version as far as stage. Y'all might think I'm a little crazy for this one, but this is the arcade version, and I think the Sega's a little closer in color representation than the SNES. The SNES does look good, but I think the colors are deeper and Sega being closer to the arcade. And it really does go without saying, no contest between the Sega, SNES, and arcade version of Mortal Kombat 2, which again, all these versions will be in the Legacy Kollection. The arcade version truly does take everything as the whole package. That is the visual, that is the sounds, and that is the details. Take a look at some of the details here. On the Super Nintendo, you'll notice there's less weapon racks, primarily the one that should be in the middle, where the Sega does display it. This in particular, I'd like to see some discussion on as far as which one's preferred by you guys, the Sega or the Super Nintendo when it comes to the ladder, also known as the mountain that has the characters' portraits on it. I could always tell when I was younger when the CPU would get cracked out is right at this part on the mountain. I still prefer Sega, but I can see why people choose Super Nintendo, especially in this example where Mileena is so deep in color she almost looks like Scarlet before Scarlet even existed. The colors definitely do look better on the SNES. I will say for lore purposes, SNES is going to take this one as well because Hornbuckle's known for having the green pants. The two characters in the background are Hornbuckle and Blaze. I don't think he was technically Blaze yet. I think they even wanted to call him Torch, but he would later become Blaze. Anyway, Hornbuckle's known for having the green pants and looking just like Liu Kang, but here in the Sega version, his pants look purple. So I guess in the Sega, we got Horn Zip Up. It really don't matter. We never see Hornbuckle anyway. Well, deeper doesn't technically mean better because Sega does look a little deeper here, but it makes the background fall back even more where it actually pops in the SNES version. So I know in most cases I choose Sega as far as stages, but Super Nintendo definitely takes the pit too for me. And to no surprise, I would say the arcade looks the best, but the Super Nintendo did a really good job getting very close to this. Now, one comparison where I think most people can actually prefer Sega would be the gore. You definitely get more blood on Sega than you do the Super Nintendo. Let's use a finisher example here. This is the Sega over here on the left. For example here, let's check out this Sub-Zero fatality. No blood splat. You do get to see some bones, not a whole lot, but really no blood splat. Oh, there's the blood. Got a little bit there. And just clarifying for those that don't know, that is an intentional move by Nintendo because they usually and still aim to be a more family-friendly console. Now, as far as Sega, I actually do prefer the colors up front on the stage, but I do think the Super Nintendo steals it as far as the background. The background on the SNES does have moving animation, you do have an audience, and then the Sega, it's static and it looks like there's less people back there. Also, being younger and thinking, wow, technically every character is still included in Mortal Kombat 2. Minus Goro, but we kinda got him in the form of Kentaro, but it was just cool to see Kano and Sonya in the background. There's things I like better about the character roster on Sega, but SNES definitely steals the show on this because you can tell where the limitation shows by how much they're using blue on Sega. Who would have known our best friend Kung Lao has a blueberry hat? Although I do prefer Reptile's green over the SNES Reptile, however, SNES's Scorpion definitely steals the show on the roster. There's no way I could give Sega this win with how Scorpion is looking on this roster. Not to mention, Shang Tsung also has a very blue beanie. Nothing wrong with the blue beanie, but historically when Shang Tsung is donning his yellow color, it's with black and not blue and yellow. And yeah, SNES Mileena definitely looks like Mileena, whereas Sega, she even still looks like Scarlet on the roster here too. And for definitive reasons, here is the arcade roster, the best looking one. This one is the standard. SNES definitely got the closest. I would say it's unanimous that most people are going to choose arcade over Sega and SNES, but for those of you that did play SNES and Sega, and those of you that haven't and have just been watching this, say for the first time, or just seen it throughout the years but seen the comparison now, I would like to know which one you like more between Sega and SNES. again, I do think I have bias and nostalgia towards Sega, and I'd like to know what you guys think. I've done a couple other comparison videos if you'd like to check those out, and I'm going to keep posting updates regarding Legacy Kollection, and I'll be live tonight, so I will see most of you there and or in the next video. Much love everyone, and take care.